When we think about the founding stories of America, we all have these images in our heads, right? Stories of courage, faith, and survival. Jamestown and Plymouth, they're the bedrock of that identity. But what if the reality, the story the survivors themselves told, was far more brutal than the myth we remember?
You know the picture I'm talking about. The Pilgrims, the Native Americans, all sitting down together for a peaceful harvest feast. It's the Thanksgiving story we all learn as kids, a story of friendship. But if you actually go back and read the accounts from the people who lived through it, you get a profoundly different and honestly, a much darker picture.
I mean, listen to this. That's a quote from George Percy, one of Jamestown's first leaders, and he's writing about the summer of 1607. This is years before the colony's absolute worst moments. So from the very beginning, this wasn't a story of easy friendship. For so many, it was a story of just unimaginable suffering. So let's dig in and see what really went down.
Okay, we're going to start with the first permanent English settlement in North America, Jamestown, founded in 1607. Its early years weren't defined by success, but by a truly horrific period that became known as the Starving Time.
It was like a perfect storm of disasters, one thing after another. A fire in 1608 left them incredibly vulnerable. But the real tipping point came in September 1609. Captain John Smith, who had managed to keep a very tense but working relationship with the local Powhatan tribe, got badly burned in a gunpowder explosion and had to sail back to England. And with Smith gone, that delicate diplomacy just completely fell apart. Chief Powhatan cut off all trade and basically put the fort under siege, trapping the colonists inside right as winter was setting in.
What happened next was an absolute catastrophe. Going into that winter, there were about 500 colonists living in Jamestown. By the time spring arrived, only 60 were left alive. Just think about that for a second. That's a survival rate of about 12%.
George Percy wrote that you can't truly describe this kind of hunger unless you've tasted its bitterness. The colonists, trapped and desperate, ate everything. They ate their horses, then their dogs and cats, then rats and mice. When those were gone, they boiled and ate the leather from their shoes. But it got so much worse.
This is where the social fabric just completely unravels. People were caught robbing the tiny public food stores and were executed for it. The survivors resorted to the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. Percy recorded them digging up fresh graves to eat the corpses. And in one of the most chilling accounts from that winter, a man murdered his pregnant wife, chopped her up, salted the flesh, and had eaten part of her before he was discovered and himself executed. This was the reality of survival in Jamestown.
All right, now let's shift gears and go north to the story we think we know a little better, the Pilgrims at Plymouth, who landed 13 years later in 1620. They also faced a brutal, deadly first winter, but their crisis and how they handled it was fundamentally different.
So a quick look at this chart tells part of the story. Plymouth's 50% survival rate is obviously way better than Jamestown's 12%, but stop and think about what that still means. Half of everyone you crossed the ocean with, your family, your friends, died in a single winter, mostly from disease and scurvy. They faced their own disaster. It just wasn't one of total social collapse and cannibalism. And the question is, why?
Well, for the Plymouth colonists, their crisis started before they even got off the boat. See, their legal charter, their permission to settle, was for Northern Virginia, basically around where New York City is today. But massive storms blew their ship, the Mayflower, way off course to Massachusetts. So legally speaking, they had no right to be there, and their contract with their investors was void. They were in a lawless situation.
And this wasn't just some abstract legal problem. People on the ship started saying out loud that once they got to shore, the leaders had no power to command them. They would use their own liberty. It was a real threat of mutiny. The whole venture was about to collapse into anarchy before it even began.
So what did they do? Instead of letting things fall apart, the leaders acted. Before anyone set foot on land, 41 of the men gathered and wrote and signed what we now call the Mayflower Compact. This was a pretty radical idea. They basically decided to create their own government from scratch. They agreed to form a civil body politic, to make their own just and equal laws, and, this is the most important part, they all promised to obey them. They chose order.
So, now we have these two very different starting points, right? One colony, Jamestown, that just spiraled into chaos, and another, Plymouth, that proactively created a social contract to prevent it. Let's see how that choice affected their actual ability to survive.
The difference is just night and day. In Jamestown, when leadership broke down, diplomacy with the Powhatan broke down, and that directly led to them starving to death. In Plymouth, their newly formed, stable government immediately sought an alliance. In the spring of 1621, they signed a formal treaty with the local Wampanoag leader, Osamakan. Now, this wasn't about some instant friendship. It was a hard-nosed political calculation for mutual protection and survival.
And the key broker for this alliance was Tisquantum, who we all know as Squanto. But his backstory is absolutely incredible and heartbreaking. He wasn't just some friendly local who happened to speak English. Years earlier, he'd been kidnapped by an English captain, sold into slavery in Spain, somehow escaped to London, and then made his way back to North America, only to find that his entire village, the Patuxet people, had been completely wiped out by diseases brought by other Europeans. The Pilgrims were literally building their new homes on top of his old one. He was the last of his people. It's hard to even imagine that level of trauma. So how did the colonists themselves process these kinds of horrifying events? To get a sense of that, let's jump back to Jamestown for a second and look at how two different writers describe that same awful act of cannibalism. So on one hand, you have George Percy. He was there, he lived through it, and he recounts the story with the straightforward horror, focusing on the cruel and inhumane act and the need for justice. But then you have John Smith, who heard the story later back in England, and his way of dealing with it is to use this shocking, dark humor. He grimly jokes that he doesn't know whether she was better roasted, boiled, or carbonadoed. It's just two completely different human ways of trying to cope with something that is truly unspeakable. Okay, so with all of this as our backdrop, the starvation, the trauma, the fragile politics, we can finally come back to that famous harvest feast in Plymouth in 1621 and see it for what it really was. First of all, the guest list. There were about 90 Wampanoag men there, which means they outnumbered the colonists, men, women, and children, by almost 2 to 1. And here's the kicker. We don't even know if they were actually invited. A very plausible theory is that the Wampanoag heard the Pilgrims firing their muskets in a kind of harvest celebration, thought the colony was being attacked, and showed up in force to see what was going on. This wasn't a cozy family dinner. It was a high-stakes political situation. And the food? Yeah, forget the modern Thanksgiving table. No pumpkin pie, no potatoes, no sweet cranberry sauce. They ate wild birds, probably ducks or geese, along with corn and stewed pumpkin. And the main course? 5 deer, which, by the way, were brought by the Wampanoag. Their contribution was a massive part of the feast.
So here's the bottom line. That harvest feast in 1621, it wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't the beautiful start of a lasting friendship. It was a brief, complicated, and very tense moment of relief in a world that was still absolutely defined by loss, trauma, and a brutal daily struggle to just stay alive. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a fragile, fragile beginning.
And that really leaves us with one last thought. The simple, clean stories we tell about where we come from, they're powerful, but they often cover up much more difficult and painful truths. So if the story of the very first Thanksgiving isn't what we've always believed, it makes you wonder, what other parts of our history have we forgotten? What else is worth taking a closer look at?